I'm very happy to be here, and I'm particularly happy because the highlight of this conference on emerging markets is Africa. So it's not every time that Africa has the spotlight. So thank you very much for organizing such an important event. How are you doing today? No. How are you doing? Fantastic, I love that. So my presentation, but I don't like to use the term presentation, I would rather say conversation, will be about investing in Africa. And, but before starting, I would like to know, have you ever visited Africa? Please, raise your hand. Oh, good, fantastic. More than 60, 70%. And are you doing business, or are you interested in doing business with Africa, please? I am at the right place. So, I am writing a book now at the Brookings on the future of business in Africa by 2030. So I think this presentation will be inspired. Many of the elements are coming from the book. So you are the first audience to which I'm interacting about this. I will spend more time on the potential of business per sector, business spending in one order, but just before and very quickly. As you know, since the 2000s, Africa has been presented as one of the fastest growing economies, second after Asia. However, many people were concerned, especially around 2014, 2016, when the growth of the continent was almost as slow as the one of the OECD. But we are seeing a change now where Africa, both in 2018, but the projection by 2022, will still be outperforming most of those economies. Of course, when I speak about Africa, Africa is a diverse continent. We have we have 55 countries which are members of the African Union. And all the regions are not growing equally. East and North Africa are the outperformer and have been almost constantly outperforming for the past decades. And again, you have discussed this morning with Antoinette and with Albert, so who have probably presented the macroeconomic perspective, so I'll not spend a lot of time there. But one of the things which I believe is very important is to highlight the fact that when we remove 3 countries, Angola, South Africa, and Nigeria, the average growth in Africa is close to 7%. So those countries, given of course just size and some of the structural challenges that they have faced, are somehow slowing down the continent. So now that we have discussed, like in terms of putting things in context, I want to engage on the aspect which I believe is more important, the tremendous potential of the continent. To evaluate the tremendous potential of the continent, one of the questions I wanted to explore was if the growth in the consumer spending, for example, in the business-to-business spending, was only related to the population growth or also to the increase of purchasing power. So in terms of population, by 2030, Africa will have about 1.7 billion people. And it's important to highlight that East and West Africa will have the largest, let's say, the fastest growth in population, have the largest gain. Of course, 50% of the African population is concentrated in 7 countries. You have Nigeria, Egypt, Tanzania, Democratic Republic of Congo, among other countries. So when considering investing in Africa, if the population size is important, you have to think that 50% of the African population will be concentrated in 7 countries. Other important fact, over 50% of the population is below the age of 25. Can you realize it? So it's critical. And it is even over 70% of the population which is below the age of 35. So those are perspectives which are critical to take into consideration when considering investing on the continent. And it is not just about the population growth. It's also about the increase of the middle class. By 2030, over 42% of Africa will be part of the middle class. Of course, we can have different definition of what a middle class could be in Africa, but I mean by middle class, a population with sufficient discretionary income to purchase consumer goods among others. So people who have more than what is absolutely necessary for living. So the combined consumer spending will be more than 2.5 trillion US dollar. This is huge. What is even more important is the growth. When you see the difference, it will be close to 800 billion just for food and beverages. So people will need to eat. So if you want to do business in Africa, think about those sectors. To eat, people will need to eat, to drink. They will need also housing, healthcare, among other critical needs. So as you can see, even the expert only focusing, or the business people only focusing on the consumer spending will have an important market. And it's the time to consider it now. By 2030, you want to have a leader, a share, an important share in the market. So, however, about 50% of the consumer spending is concentrated in 3 countries. Can you guess which one? It is obvious, huh? Yes, Egypt, South Africa, and Nigeria are the countries where consumer spending is the most important. So, an interesting fact, because when people think about Africa, it is quite often, at least in the interaction that I have had, it's very difficult to imagine that African market will grow faster than the other developing countries one. But when you look at their consumption growth in Africa compared to other developing countries, you can see that, of course, Africa taken as a region, you can see that in most of, if not all of the areas, Africa will outperform in terms of consumption. So it's critical. By investing in Africa, you are likely to receive much more than by investing in any other country in terms of consumption growth. So is it clear for everyone? So yeah, I think it is extremely important to seriously consider the consumer spending. But beyond that, there is also a critical aspect, the business-to-business spending. Well, when you look at the business-to-business spending, almost 4.2 trillion USD. It's huge. And we also have a substantial growth. Here, as you can see, agriculture and agri-processing will be the largest sector, but it is easy to connect that. In the consumer spending, Do you recall what was the largest sector? Absolutely. So they are connected. Food and beverages and agriculture and agri-processing or agro-industry. So those are extremely important. Not far from some study, but even if I found about more than 900 billion, some study estimate that it may even be up to 1 trillion. Only for agriculture is important. It's really critical. Of course, you have other critical sector, manufacturing, construction, and broader commerce and distribution. So it is extremely important to shift the way we think about Africa. One of the solutions that I often promote is not just aid, it's trade, it's business. It's the best way to empower people. It's the best way to, young people, for example, I spoke about some statistic, and young people are twice as likely to be unemployed than adults. So one of the solutions, and they are more likely also to live below poverty line than adults. So one of the solutions to poverty in Africa is definitively business. And the development of different sectors, including the manufacturing, will play a key role. So again, here we have about 50% of this business-to-business spending will be in 3 sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and construction infrastructure. So if you are targeting the largest sectors, those are the sectors to look at when you want to do business in Africa, so agriculture, manufacturing, and construction. So in terms of agriculture, just to provide you with some illustration, about 60% of the world unused arable land is located in Africa. 60% about. However, Africa is one of the continents with the highest level of undernourished people. And Africa imports more than export food. This is not normal, isn't it? Something seems, something's wrong. And people have to do something. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it is also providing a lot of a higher return on investment than in many other markets. So many countries are present. I can see that the slide with the different computers are slightly different, but if you just listen to me with my French accent, my Francophone accent, then you will get everything. So many countries are present: China, India, South Korea, Saudi Arabia. They are either leasing or buying land on the continent. So it's the time to be present. It's the time to move, to grow crops. And one of the things is about 50% of the African population work in the agricultural sector, but the sector only provides about 25% of GDP share. So there's a lot of catch-up in terms of agricultural productivity that we can have. Now, you can be thinking, where should I go? Which country? Of course, I will tell you Cameroon. Can you guess why? But that is not the only reason. It's not just Cameroon. Strategic places is the best places are the one where you have an important proportion of unused arable land on one hand, but also coastal countries, because you reduce the cost of transport. So those countries include Cameroon, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Angola, Madagascar, among other countries. So the darkest blue on the graph. So those are the strategic countries, but for different reasons, you can also go to other countries, depending as if you are interested in the international versus local market. So now speaking about manufacturing. Manufacturing is also an important area for growth on the continent. You can see here for some countries, such as Zambia or Ghana, have received an important proportion of foreign direct investment in the manufacturing sector in Africa. So it's extremely important. Africa is still lagging, however, if you have to compare Africa with the rest of the world in terms of manufacturing development or productivity. So sub-Saharan Africa is here. So you see that the level of investment is much smaller than for other regions. However, China will lose 85 to 100 million labor-intensive jobs. This represents an important opportunity for the continent to seize a proportion of those jobs from China. Africa is not the only continent. Other regions of the world will also be interested in having some of these jobs. And just as a reminder, like the business-to-business spending in the manufacturing sector will be over $600 billion. And that is not cumulative, it's just in 2030. So if you look at it from a cumulative perspective, it will be much more important. So when you think about Africa, to think about opportunities. So in terms of construction and infrastructure, have you ever heard about PIDA? So it's the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, which is one of the continental initiatives aiming at solving the infrastructure gap on the continent with investment in areas such as water, transport, energy, information and communication technologies. So we can see that investment is growing across regions there. So in electricity, when you compare Africa to the rest of the world, in electricity, for example, Africa is lagging in rail lines, or in quality of port, Africa is lagging. So we have an important need that may be related, and I will relate that later, to the cost of doing business in Africa. But if this is a challenge, it is also an important opportunity, especially as the level of investment commitment has substantially increased in the infrastructure sector. And if you connect it to housing, we'll also see that 1.7 billion people will need to have a place to live. So now, in terms of information and communication technologies, around the 2000s, at the end of the 90s, New York City has more mobile phone subscribers than the whole continent. Now, Africa have had the fastest growing ICT sector. So we can see that although Africa, the performance may be slightly below the one of the world, a limited number of people will have thought that about 80% of penetration will have been reached on the continent. So, of course, we have numerous opportunities in various sectors. Those may be related to low-cost mobile phone, tablets, etc., but also to mobile health, mobile money. I guess many of you who are in Africa have seen or even done transaction in those sectors. And you have probably heard about M-Pesa or the CardioPad from Cameroon, the ability to consult for health issues with medical doctor. And those technologies are critical. Let me give you an illustration. Before, when small farmers had to sell their product, they were just selling to the best offer, local offer. But now, with mobile phones, they can figure out that 2 or 3 miles further, they can have 20 to 30% more for their product. That is huge. And you also know with Rwanda, the drone delivering blood. So those technologies are really making a substantial difference on the continent. An area, because if we compare the mobile penetration rate to the internet one, the darker blue, an area of growth or of is definitively the internet penetration. So that is a critical area. And many countries have the right infrastructure providing those opportunities or for investors to seize those opportunities. If you look at North Africa with countries such as Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, so you have a very high level of network readiness. Or South Africa, among others, are very important countries offering the right opportunities. So, having spoken about the opportunity, and just to sum up the opportunity, by 2030, Africa will have more than 1.7 billion people and more than 6.7 trillion USD of combined consumer and business spending. If you are not there, you are missing something. So, but to be successful in Africa, you also have to manage multiple challenges. Those include corruption. At many airports, even when leaving the countries, I often see people asking, oh, do you have something to give to me? I do as if I don't understand what they're saying. So, but corruption, as you can see, the darkest red color are the most corrupt countries. But the difference is that, an interesting point is that, although in the media, when people speak about corruption in Africa, they speak as if Africa is the continent where, it's the only continent where we have corruption. When you look comparatively, and that's why I put the world map, so you can see that, you can see that there's nothing particular about Africa. And of course, even among the developed countries, the less corrupt, you see that Canada is a lighter yellow than one country I will not name. So, the cost of doing business is also a challenge. As you can see, sub-Saharan Africa, the cost of import is much higher than the cost of import in other regions, and the cost of export, although lower than the one of import, is still high. It's still too high. So those are factors to take into consideration. But one thing which is certain is if you are producing in Africa to export, you are likely to pay much lower cost, so which will be a very good thing to do. Of course, the private sector is not as much supported compared to other regions. So you can see that in Africa, which has a performance which is not very different from the one of Latin America, the level of support for the private sector is much lower compared to the average of the OECD of the most developed countries. So we also have a large informal sector. It may be considered as both an opportunity or a challenge, but it's still important to bear in mind that over 45% of the business operation are related to the informal sector. So some entrepreneurs have found a way to formalize the informal sector or to deal in the banking sector, for example, providing a substantial return of investment. Finally, the Global Competitiveness Index Africa or many of the African countries may be lagging. The darkest color blue are the most competitive countries. So many of the African countries are lagging compared to the rest of the world, but those challenges are also faced by some Latin American countries and by some Eastern European and Asian countries. So when you put things in perspective, you can see that the perceived risk in Africa is much higher than the actual risk if you compare to the other region. So that's why I love comparing. So, however, those challenges could also be turned into opportunity, and I will be going quite quickly so that we can have the opportunity to interact and to have a question and answer session. But for example, in agriculture, one of the strengths, of course, the fastest or one of the fastest growing sector with the largest demand, both in terms of consumer spending, but also in terms of business spending. However, some of the challenges are related to the vulnerability, climate change, or to the level of productivity. So this is, those are some of the challenges. But again, if you want to be wealthy, purchase a land in Africa. Do agriculture. I can give you so many examples of people gaining more than 500% of return in less than 10 years for land value, not necessarily in terms of agricultural transformation. In terms of agricultural transformation, it's probably much lower, but still very important. So, and values could be captured everywhere, from the primary inputs, production and processing, transportation infrastructure, etc. So you have opportunities definitively at different levels. In the manufacturing sector, you have a huge market. Of course, many of the products will need to be transformed, but beyond that fact, it's the second largest, or one of the second or third largest market by 2030. And for have written a few pieces or article on it, have you heard about the African Continental Free Trade Area? Have you heard about it? Yeah. So, the African Continental Free Trade Area was adopted last month by the 44 head of states and government. And the goal is to have all the African Union members, so the 55 African Union members, joining the initiative to promote free trade, a free movement of people, a free movement of products, of services in Africa. It is anticipated to increase by at least 50% intra-African trade, horizon 2022 or so, and to eventually even double intra-Africa trade when the non-tariff barriers will also be lifted. So those are tremendous opportunity to say, of course, the agreements need to be implemented. It will come into force when more than 20 countries will have signed or ratified, but it is a good sign that few people will have imagined, such a successful initiative. An interesting point is that 30 countries have also signed the Free Movement of People Protocol. So you can see that things are changing, moving toward the right direction on the continent. And it is likely to increase manufacturing for many reasons. When African countries trade with each other, more than 40% of the products that they exchange are manufactured good. Contrarily, than when they trade with the rest of the world, where less than 18% of the products are manufactured products. So, and which who speaks about the development of the manufacturing sector. We also speak about improvement of human capital, among other reduction of poverty, increase in employment. And an interesting fact is that the labor cost is much lower in Africa compared to the other regions, except Asia, or except many Asian countries such as China or India. Now, in terms of construction and infrastructure, I spoke about PIDA, so it's a huge sector, a lot of commitment, critical needs, transport, among other things. But the problem with infrastructure, as they are very long-term projects, may be the political stability in many of the countries. When corporations are investing $billions, they want to be certain that political stability political instability will not bring troubles, like will not prevent them to have their return, to seize their return on investment. So, and as you can also see the evolution of investment commitments in Africa in the infrastructure sector. So it is growing, although you have a little fluctuation, but the trend is toward an improvement. Information and communication technologies. We have spoken about the digital transformation that we have in Africa now, so it is one of the strengths with many public-private partnerships among other factors, but one of the challenges will probably be the regulation. Quite often government, especially when you have civil unrest, will shut down. Some governments, the less democratic one, will shut down internet and then interrupt communication in social media or Twitter, etc. But increasingly new technologies are preventing these shutdowns to happen. So, as discussed also, internet is definitively an area where there's a lot of opportunities. And here I'm just presenting some quick facts. You have a much higher proportion of men, so it's a lot of work to be done there also to bridge the gap between women and men in terms of access to internet. We also have a gap, the urban versus rural gap, so it's important to ensure that people in rural areas, I was speaking about the small farmers, sometimes they may be needing to have access to those technology more than people in cities. So it's very important to bridge the gap. And of course, also here, young people have a much higher access compared to people above 45. So we can say that if for mobile subscription, we have a very fast trend, internet is still slightly lagging, progressing, but there's a huge room for improvement. So, and a few considerations for the one of you who have already been or who are considering going to Africa very soon. Dealing on the African continent is important to consider the culture, business culture, etiquette, protocol. Things may sometimes, depending on the country, of course, it's very important to not overgeneralize, but quite paternalistic. So it's important to be clear and to be straightforward. The instruction which will not be given will not be understood as authorized. So people may not do things because then they will have the responsibility. Where here in the US, entrepreneurship, for example, and initiative, the sense of initiative is much more present as people care about output versus the process. Of course, also, when negotiating, you have to be patient, and if you don't concede something, people will think, even if you have made the best offer, if you don't concede something, people will think that you are cheating on them. So it is better to have a higher pricing eventually and then concede a bit less that come and say, oh, this is the real best offer I can provide, and then I cannot do anything more. They may even be purchasing something at a higher cost just because they think that something is wrong with you. So, having said that, if you do not invest or do business in Africa, or at least seriously consider it, now you are missing one of the biggest opportunity of the 21st century. Thank you very much for your attention.